Some photos capture history, others, they trap its ghosts. A doctor who unknowingly saved the future dictator of Nazi Germany. A dictator's palace turned into a playground for soldiers. A woman smiling in the face of a 20-year prison sentence because she knew her captors wouldn't last that long. These are not just images, they are frozen moments, haunting, powerful, and unforgettable. But look closer, because behind each of these photos lies a story that you won't believe. And once you've seen them, you'll never look at history the same way again. Welcome to Dark Chronicles, let's dive into history. 64 years in Parliament. 6 decades shaping history. And on July 27, 1964, Winston Churchill walked out of the House of Commons for the last time. At 89 years old, he was frail, his once powerful stride now slow and deliberate. This was the man who had defied Hitler, who had stood alone against Nazi Germany when all of Europe had fallen. The leader who had uttered words that echoed through time, "We shall fight on the beaches." When he first entered Parliament in 1900, Queen Victoria was still on the throne. By the time he left, the Beatles were at their best. Britain had changed beyond recognition. The empire he once led was unraveling, the Cold War was at its peak, and a new generation no longer saw him as the hero he once was. As he reached the exit, did he pause? Did he glance back one last time? The chamber where he had fought, argued, and shaped the world was behind him now, a titan fading into history. 17 years after the war, Otto Frank returned to the attic where his family had hidden from the Nazis. He was the only one who survived. From July 1942 to August 1944, 8 people had lived in silence behind a hidden bookcase, hoping the world outside would forget them. But someone betrayed them. They were arrested, deported. Otto was sent to Auschwitz. His wife and daughters, Anne and Margot, were sent to Bergen-Belsen. They never came back. Now, he stood alone in the empty room, where Anne Frank had written her diary, where she had dreamed of freedom. The walls still bore the postcards she had pinned up. Photographer Arnold Newman captured this moment. He didn't pose Otto, he simply watched as the grief settled in. Otto Frank once said, "To build a future, you have to know the past." But in that moment, standing in the attic, the past was all he had left. The year is 1907. Off the coast of Zanzibar, a British naval patrol intercepts a dhow, a traditional sailing vessel. Shackled together inside, a group of enslaved Africans bound for the markets of the Middle East. The Royal Navy had been hunting slavers since 1808, enforcing Britain's abolition of the slave trade. But by the early 20th century, the East African slave trade was still alive. The man in the photograph is moments away from true freedom. A British blacksmith stationed aboard HMS Sphinx cuts away the iron shackles from his ankles. For him, this moment marks the end of captivity. But what future awaits him? Even after abolition, former slaves often faced persecution, forced labor, or worse, re-enslavement. This image is a reminder that breaking the chains is just the beginning. True freedom is far harder to secure. April 2003. The US invasion of Iraq is in full swing. In just 3 weeks, Saddam Hussein's regime collapses. His palaces, once symbols of absolute control, are abandoned. And then, this moment. An American soldier, dressed in full combat gear, sliding down the marble railing of a grand staircase inside Saddam's palace. A scene that looks more like a college prank than an occupation. Just months earlier, stepping inside this palace without permission would have been unthinkable. Now US troops roamed freely, turning opulence into a playground. The war was far from over. Iraq would soon spiral into chaos with insurgency and civil unrest. But in this photo, war seems almost fun. A dictator's empire had fallen, and for a brief moment history paused, just long enough for a soldier to enjoy the ride. Bolivia, October 9, 1967. A man, battered and exhausted, sits in a small schoolhouse, surrounded by Bolivian soldiers. He knows what's coming. This is Che Guevara, the Argentine revolutionary who helped overthrow the Cuban government alongside Fidel Castro. After years of trying to export revolution across Latin America, he was finally caught. Standing next to him in the photo is Felix Rodriguez, a Cuban exile turned CIA agent. Rodriguez had been tracking Guevara for months, advising Bolivian forces. The US didn't want a trial, they wanted an execution. Before his death, Guevara reportedly told his executioner, "Shoot, coward, you are only killing a man." His body was displayed like a trophy before being secretly buried. His hands were even cut off to prevent anyone from denying his death. But Guevara's legend only grew. The man who dreamed of global revolution became an eternal symbol of defiance. A group of indigenous children sit in rows, hands folded in forced prayer, watching over them, a nun, a symbol of control, a symbol of something darker. For over a century, indigenous children in Canada were taken from their families and placed in residential schools, institutions designed to erase their culture. Many were run by the Catholic Church with support from the government. Survivors recall brutal discipline, malnutrition, and abuse. Many never made it out. Recent discoveries of unmarked graves near former school sites have revealed a horrifying truth. Thousands of children vanished. This photo is more than a historical record. It's a reminder of a system that sought to erase identities. A reminder of voices that were silenced. And for those who survived, the scars remain. The story of these children is a brutal and dark part of history. Let me know in the comments if you want to know more about. A courtroom filled with the echoes of history, the weight of justice hanging over every defendant. The Nuremberg Trials, 1945. This was the moment when the world held the Nazi leaders accountable for war crimes. The charges were grave: crimes against humanity, genocide, mass murder. The atmosphere? Cold, tense, relentless. And yet something unexpected happened. A simple mistake in translation. The prosecutor misspoke while explaining the Nazi chain of command. Suddenly, Hermann Göring, Hitler's right-hand man, erupted in protest. "I was number 2, not Hess!" he exclaimed, waving his arms indignantly. Then laughter. Rudolf Hess, supposedly suffering from amnesia, turned to Göring and burst out laughing. Captured in a single photograph, it's a moment of eerie levity amid the weight of their crimes. These men, responsible for millions of deaths, were laughing, as if they were still in control. They weren't. One by one the sentences came: death, life in prison. And for some, like Göring, a cowardly escape through cyanide. But for a fleeting second they thought they could laugh off justice. An empty room, a sea of buttons, switches and monitors. The air feels thick, almost suffocating. This is Chernobyl, 1986. The control room of Reactor 4, the epicenter of the worst nuclear disaster in history. Hours before the explosion, operators here were running a safety test. A test that should never have happened. Instructions were ignored, warnings were dismissed. And then, in an instant, a deadly chain reaction began. The control rods, meant to stop the reactor, did the opposite. They triggered an explosion. And now look at this room. This photograph, taken before the disaster, shows the very place where history changed forever. The switches remain, the dials untouched, but the men, gone forever. Many of them perished from radiation poisoning in days. Others fought for their lives for years. What remains is this haunting image, a frozen moment in time, a reminder of human error, of arrogance, of catastrophe. A young man, dressed in uniform, casually stares into the camera. No official pose, no grand royal setting, just a simple portrait, one that seems almost modern. This is Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia. A ruler often depicted in grandiose paintings and staged photographs. But here, he looks like any other young man experimenting with a camera. But there's something eerie about this moment. Nicholas loved photography. His family too documented their lives extensively, smiling, laughing, unaware of the storm approaching, because history remembers him not as the carefree young man in this image, but as the last emperor of Russia, deposed, imprisoned, and executed with his entire family. What started as a hobby, capturing fleeting moments of life, became a haunting archive of a dynasty's downfall. And this is one of the oldest selfies in history, taken by a man who never saw the modern world he unknowingly anticipated. The plane's engines roar as passengers climb aboard. A journey is beginning, one that will change their lives forever. The year is 1949. Across Yemen, thousands of Jewish families have just been expelled from their ancestral homes. Centuries of history, traditions, and culture gone in an instant. What awaits them is a land they have never seen but have always heard about, Israel, a country barely a year old, a land of hope, but also uncertainty. And now, take a look at this image. This is Operation Magic Carpet, a daring rescue mission that airlifted over 49,000 Yemenite Jews to Israel. With barely any possessions, many boarded a plane for the first time in their lives, believing they were fulfilling an ancient prophecy of return. Some would find a new home. Others would face hardship and discrimination, struggling to integrate into Israeli society, but for them, there was no turning back. The Yemenite Jewish community in Yemen, once vibrant, was erased almost overnight, and today, only a handful remain. A tomb sealed for nearly 400 years. A king long gone yet still holding a grip on history. Gustav Vasa, the father of modern Sweden. In 1523 he freed his country from Danish rule and laid the foundation of an independent Swedish state. Ruthless, brilliant and feared, he crushed revolts, centralized power, and made Sweden a Protestant nation. But in 1945, something extraordinary happened. His tomb was opened in Uppsala Cathedral for renovations. When archaeologists lifted the lid, they found him, still wearing his crown and holding his sword. And now, look at this eerie image. A skeleton draped in royal garments, his ornate crown resting atop a grinning skull. His sword, once a symbol of power, still by his side. But time had won. The flesh had decayed, the kingdom had moved on, and Gustav Vasa was nothing more than a relic of the past. For centuries he ruled with an iron fist. But in the end, even kings must fade into history. A quiet stretch of land, sacred, untouched, home to the Mohawk people for generations. Then came the announcement. The Canadian government approved the expansion of a private golf course, on land belonging to the Mohawk Nation. The response? A blockade, a standoff, a battle for dignity. July 1990, the Oka crisis begins. For 78 days, indigenous warriors stood their ground against the Canadian military. Barbed wire, tanks, sniper nests. It felt less like a protest and more like a war zone. And then, something unforgivable. A 14-year-old Mohawk girl was bayoneted in the chest while carrying her 4-year-old sister. She survived, but the message was clear. The government would take the land, no matter the cost. And today, look at this photo. A Mohawk warrior charges forward, defying an army, refusing to surrender. He fought, they fought, but in the end, Canada took the land. A golf course now rests atop sacred ground, but the memory of this fight, it will never be buried. The camera rolls. The soldiers take their positions. A woman stands nearby, watching intently. She is Leni Riefenstahl, Hitler's personal filmmaker, the mastermind behind Nazi propaganda films like Triumph of the Will and Olympia. She was the visual architect of the Nazi myth, crafting images that glorified the Reich. But on September 12, 1939, in the Polish town of Konski, she witnessed something that wasn't staged. A group of Jewish civilians stood lined up against a wall. Orders were given. Gunfire erupted, and for the first time, Leni Riefenstahl saw the true face of the regime she had helped elevate. Now look at this photo. Her expression is frozen, shock, fear, or guilt. She would later claim she had no idea about the atrocities of the Holocaust, that she was just a filmmaker, not a Nazi. But the truth? She kept working for the Reich, even using forced labor for her later films. Leni Riefenstahl lived until 2003, avoiding justice, rewriting her own story. But history never forgets. A group of men sit casually, hundreds of feet above the ground. No safety harnesses, no fear, just lunch on a steel beam. You've seen this photo before. But what you probably haven't seen is the man who took it. Meet Charles Ebbets, the photographer who risked his life to capture one of the most famous images of all time. Look at this rare shot. Ebbets himself, camera in hand, balanced on a narrow beam high above New York City. The year is 1932. America is deep in the Great Depression, but here, men build the future. The Empire State Building rises. The skyline is forever changed. Ebbets' photo became an enduring symbol, not just of New York, but of human resilience. And yet, for years, his name was forgotten. Only decades later did historians uncover the truth. This daredevil with a camera was the real hero behind the lens. 3 astronauts stand together, hands clasped, mock praying for their spacecraft. They smile, their faces full of confidence. At first glance, it looks like a lighthearted joke, a parody of their official crew photo. But within months, this would become one of the most chilling images in space history. This is the crew of Apollo 1, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. They were preparing for the first manned mission of the Apollo program, the mission that was supposed to pave the way for landing on the moon. But on January 27, 1967, during a routine test, a spark ignited the highly oxygenated air inside their capsule. The fire spread in seconds. The hatch was sealed. There was no escape. All 3 astronauts perished. NASA had ignored warning signs, the design was flawed, and safety concerns were dismissed. In this photo, they joke about the integrity of their spacecraft. They had no idea their prayer would go unanswered. A woman stands in armor, a sword resting against her shoulder. The gaze is soft, serene, but the stance is resolute. At first, it looks like a historical painting of Joan of Arc, but look closer. This is Thérèse of Lisieux, one of the most beloved Catholic saints, dressed as Joan of Arc. The year is 1897. Thérèse, a young Carmelite nun, is participating in a small convent play. She had long admired Joan, seeing in her both a warrior and a woman of faith. But here's the irony. Thérèse would be canonized as a saint before Joan of Arc. Thérèse's story is not one of battles, but of quiet devotion. She died at just 24 years old, leaving behind writings that would inspire millions. Today, she is one of the Church's most influential figures, and this remains the only known photograph of a saint cosplaying as another saint. For years they lived in hell on earth, Auschwitz, the deadliest concentration camp of World War II. Over 1 million men, women and children perished here, most of them Jewish. And then, on January 27, 1945, the Red Army arrived. The Nazi guards had fled, but thousands of prisoners were left behind, starving, sick, barely alive. At first they couldn't believe it. Some were too weak to react, others fell to their knees and wept. And then, this moment. Look at this photo. Faces once hollow with despair, now bursting with joy. They had survived, they had won. Some held bottles of champagne, some laughed, some cheered. After years of horror, this was their first taste of freedom. But not all were so lucky. Many died even after liberation, their bodies too broken to recover. This image stands as proof of suffering, survival, and the unbreakable will to live, because in the end, they were still here, and the Nazis were not. A woman smiles as she slices into her birthday cake. Her elegant dress, her carefully styled hair, the festive atmosphere. This could be anywhere in the world. But this is Tehran, 1973. And in just 5 years, everything would change. At the time, Iran was a nation in transition. Under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the country was undergoing rapid modernization. Western-style fashion, music and cinema flourished in the cities. Women, especially those from the urban elite, enjoyed freedoms unthinkable just a few decades earlier. Higher education, careers and social gatherings without restrictions were becoming the norm. But beneath this seemingly glamorous surface, tensions simmered. The Shah's policies, while progressive, were deeply unpopular with the conservative majority. Economic inequality, political repression, and a growing disconnect between the ruling elite and the working class fueled unrest. By the late 1970s, protests erupted across the country demanding an end to the monarchy. This birthday celebration, frozen in time, is a glimpse into a world that was about to vanish. Just 5 years later, the Islamic Revolution would sweep through Iran, transforming society overnight. Dress codes would be enforced, personal freedoms curtailed, and images like this, of unveiled women celebrating openly, would become relics of a bygone era. A doctor in his white coat, standing tall, unaware that history would place him in the most bizarre contradiction imaginable. His name? Eduard Bloch, an Austrian physician. A man known for his kindness. But in 1907, one patient changed everything. A boy barely 18, desperate to save his dying mother. Bloch treated her, waiving fees, doing everything he could. The boy's name? Adolf Hitler. Years later, that same boy would launch the deadliest regime in history, sending millions, including Jewish doctors, into death camps. But Bloch? He was spared. Hitler personally protected him, calling him an honorary Aryan. A grotesque irony in a world where millions were slaughtered for being Jewish. And now look at this photo. Captured in 1926, Bloch had no idea that the boy he once comforted would go on to destroy an entire generation. A doctor who saved lives. A patient who ended them. The air is thick with tension, soldiers huddle together, the ramps are about to drop. This is the moment before history unfolds. June 6, 1944, D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion the world has ever seen. These men, barely out of their teens, had one order: land, push forward, don't stop. They knew the odds. The first waves faced relentless machine gun fire, the sand turned red within minutes. Then the landing craft ramp hits the water. Now, look at this photo. This is what they saw, the jaws of death ahead of them. Each step could be their last, yet they kept moving forward. Some never made it past the surf, but enough of them did. By nightfall, Omaha Beach belonged to them, and history was changed forever. A courtroom, packed with spectators. Whispers fill the air. In the front row, a group of men sits silently. But something is off. They keep their faces hidden. The year is 1931. Al Capone, the king of Chicago, is finally on trial. Not for murder, not for bootlegging, but for tax evasion. The one crime they could pin on him. Yet the real mystery lies in this photo. These men, who are they? Associates, witnesses, rivals waiting for Capone to fall? Now look at their hands. Gripping hats covering their faces, hiding from the camera, but from whom? Were they afraid of Capone's wrath or of what would happen if he lost control of his empire? Capone went to prison, but the Chicago underworld didn't disappear. In the shadows, these men, whoever they were, knew the game wasn't over. It was just changing hands. History is full of moments like these. Some shocking, some tragic, some nearly forgotten. But each of these photos captures a story frozen in time. A glimpse into a past that still shapes our world today. And if you want more powerful historical images, check out my historical footage playlist, where I dive even deeper into the moments that defined history. You can also find the previous episodes in this series of 20 haunting historical photos, because trust me, there are plenty more stories to tell. Click here to continue exploring the past. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. There's so much more history waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, stay safe.